I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. Thanks for joining me for this special edition of On Watch. This is a bulletin, an update on a rather grave national security crisis related directly to our southern border and our security. And the story revolves around actions and activities in Guatemala. You may ask yourself, why do I care about Guatemala when it's a U.S. border issue? The reason why is because it ties directly to the Safe Third Nation or Asylum deal that President Trump has agreed to with the Guatemalan government. Let me give you some backstory. This is vitally important if you understand the seditious conspiracy within the State Department to undermine our national security and to support leftist ideologues in Guatemala, and the danger it poses not just to our national security, but to our friends and allies in Guatemala. The Morales administration, President Morales, his administration is trying to do the right thing, but he's facing opposition and really subversion, sabotage from our State Department. And let me tell you, President Trump is not well served. Here are the details. The agreement between the U.S. and Guatemala was signed on July 12th. That's a good thing. They're currently, right now, as we speak, working out the technical details. Acting Secretary of Homeland Security McAleenan is in Guatemala today as we speak. He and a staff of people are conducting these technical meetings, working out the fine print, the details of how to work out this asylum deal. What you don't realize, or what you may not know from the headlines, is that the first effort at an asylum deal between the U.S. and Guatemala was sabotaged by leftist ideologues, real deep state actors in the State Department, who actually leaked the planned agreement to the New Yorker magazine. The New Yorker quite proudly trumpets in their article about how they got an advanced copy of the deal, of the plan that was going to be initialed. That sort of agitation propaganda spun up enough controversy that the deal, which essentially mirrors the same deal we have with Canada, it's hardly radical and it's hardly controversial, but they made it sound like it was some off-the-wall idea. That effort to controversialize the plan started in our State Department, was supported by and was, the subversion of the deal was supported by Ambassador Arriaga, our ambassador to Guatemala, and other sort of like-minded leftists, sort of the establishment types in the State Department. And so President Trump is not well served by Ambassador Arriaga and by a host of people in the State Department. But what was done here is that the agreement that was supposed to be signed was delayed about a week. It finally was signed, and as we speak, Acting Secretary McAleenan of Homeland Security is in Guatemala working out the technical details of how this asylum plan will work. The idea is that Guatemala would hold people there and not allow them to travel north, and that their asylum applications would be processed and dealt with there. In return, the country of Guatemala would receive, obviously, financial consideration and incentives, everything from humanitarian support, engineering support, communications, a host of things to really support and help the country of Guatemala while at the same time they help us. So it's a mutually beneficial deal, but it's being undermined by careerists, by leftist ideologues at the State Department. How this manifests itself on the ground in Guatemala is the activities, the sort of clandestine relationships that Ambassador Luis Arriaga has with leftists in the Guatemalan political environment. And so President Morales is from a center-right party. He has substantial opposition from the left in the country. Ambassador Arriaga, who was actually born and raised in Guatemala, it's somewhat interesting that his affinity for his original homeland may blur his vision with some respects, but nonetheless, he's there. He represents President Trump. But he has a particular affinity for folks on the left, the political opposition to the folks who are trying to undermine and sabotage this asylum plan. That manifests itself a few ways. One of the ways is that the U.S. Embassy rewards the left and punishes the right in Guatemala. And so a very sort of subtle way in which they do that is, or has to do with visas. You'll find, if you do a little long-term study of how the embassy operates in Guatemala, if you're on the right and you support President Trump and you support President Morales, you find that your visa application to come to the United States is somehow mysteriously delayed, or it's held up, or it's lost, or it's not renewed. While if you're on the left, magically your visa to come to the United States is moved through the process very smoothly. This empowers the left and really is used as an intimidation tactic against elected officials, people in public policy arena in Guatemala. If you're on the right, you're punished and intimidated. If you're on the left, you're a friend of Ambassador Arriaga, all goes well. The biggest opponent, frankly, in my opinion, of this deal between Guatemala and the United States is our very own ambassador, Luis Arriaga. He has allies and sort of kindred spirits within the State Department, the Western Hemisphere Bureau. But those efforts, that sort of cooperation, the use of tactics like withholding and delaying visas, these are all the efforts tied around trying to create maximum confusion. When the New Yorker magazine got an advance copy of the plan for this asylum deal, that was leaked from the State Department. That was an effort to sabotage the plan ever going forward in the first place. When Guatemalan folks on the left sought to challenge the asylum plan or deal, you'll note that a number of the folks who are actually filing lawsuits and trying to create maximum confusion, actually from the political left in Guatemala, just happen to be associates and colleagues or friends with Ambassador Arriaga. This is a pattern we see over and over again. The president's not well served. Of all the things that I've discussed so far with respect to this plan and how it was instituted, how it's trying to be sort of subverted as we speak now, another factor in all of this is that the Guatemalans are approaching an election. On August 11th, they're due to have a runoff election in their presidential contest. The candidate on the left, named Sandra Torres, is an avowed socialist, unabashedly so. She's quite proud of that. In the 1990s, she has affiliations with leftist guerrillas. So this is somebody who is a fellow traveler of those on the left. And surprise, surprise, although the election is scheduled for the 11th, guess who's going to show up in Guatemala on the 8th of August? Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi and a congressional delegation that I understand will include Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, among others. That crowd of folks is going to show up 3 days before the election in Guatemala. What do you think the influence or the impact will be when the Speaker of the House arrives on the scene to inspect conditions on the ground in Guatemala, at a time point immediately before their presidential runoff election? What are the consequences? Will the Speaker attack President Trump from overseas? Will the Speaker call into question the agreement that the people are working on now to try to have come to fruition despite internal sabotage? There's a lot of questions about this visit. There's a side note to this, and that is there are challenges to this election in Guatemala on the 11th of August because of irregularities in the previous runoff or the lead up to this election. And so the entire election itself may be postponed and a new, fresh election launched in October. That's sort of an internal Guatemalan issue. The courts are looking at that now in Guatemala. It's enormously contentious. It's a real left-right divide or split in the country. But the consequences for an ambassador and the embassy staff and their political alignment, which is 180 degrees out from what President Trump wants, actively working against the plan to secure our border, and then Speaker Pelosi showing up on the scene 3 days before a presidential runoff election has enormous consequences. And here's why. The agreement that we've signed with Guatemala, which increases their security and their stability and subsidizes and finances and incentivizes a stronger, better Guatemala, also helps us. That's the whole reason why we have a deal like this. But if you have Speaker Pelosi showing up 3 days before a national presidential election and de facto endorsing a leftist candidate by the name of Sandra Torres, should she become president, the grave danger, the long-term view, something we'd be talking about a year from now, would be Guatemala sliding into the camp of Nicaragua and Venezuela. We will have another failed socialist country sitting to our immediate south. Mexico is already, to a large degree, a failed narco-terror state. Guatemala is de facto our southern border at this point. We're making advances with respect to this agreement with Guatemala. A President Torres, come January, would no doubt unilaterally break that deal. Her socialist programs would drive Guatemala towards a Venezuela and Nicaragua-styled failed socialist experiment. What would that do to the stability and the economic conditions in Guatemala? Well, it would make it, I think, remarkably worse than the current conditions are. What would that do to the influx of people heading north to our southern border? Obviously, it would jack those numbers through the roof. So there are some immediate problems that have to do with our State Department, with Ambassador Arriaga, with this plan for asylum cooperation with Guatemala. That's what's right in front of us. Down the road a little bit is this national election in Guatemala and which way the country goes. If they slide socialists, it really poses a very grave concern. But the long term to that is that you would even see potentially, not that it's there's no certitude in this, but potentially Guatemala might just slide back into a state of civil war, one that raged from the 60s through the 90s, because the country is that divided. There's that much polarization, and there are that many forces on the left seeking to stir up and create this much turmoil. And frankly, they have allies in the US Congress. There are folks, and you see them at presidential debates, who believe in an open border, that anybody can cross, that they all get free health care. That is a magnet, right? And they view those, perhaps they view those people as future voters. But the focal point or the issue I'm trying to get across to you today is that we've got a good asylum plan that could be acted on, that could reinforce our border, that could assist Guatemala in development and stabilizing its country. And there are all sorts of factions working against it. There are leftists in Guatemala filing lawsuits. There's our own very questionable US Embassy presence in Guatemala. There's the relationship with the ambassador. There's questions about the Western Hemisphere division at State Department. And then on top of that, there are domestic political questions in Guatemala with their own presidential election, only complicated by the arrival of Speaker Pelosi on a congressional delegation 3 days before the election. This is very serious stuff. A year from now, when Guatemala potentially is in tremendous turmoil, and we ask ourselves, how did it get this way? Who let the ball drop? Who wasn't on watch to see what was going on? I want you to remember what I'm warning you about today, about these very grave concerns, these dangers that in and of themselves are bad enough, but when you compile and compound these factors, they present a threat, a warning, a set of circumstances that are against the best interests of the United States, and for that matter, against the peace and security and stability of Guatemala. Guatemala does not deserve to turn into Venezuela or Nicaragua. The people of Guatemala are owed stability, law and order, and some sense, some chance for a peaceful, happy existence and prosperity. The path we're currently going down is enormously destabilizing. It doesn't do the Guatemalans any good, and it certainly doesn't do the United States any good. And I think a lot of these factors are playing out, literally as I make this video and talk to you today. A lot of these different components of this problem are playing out on the ground. And I call upon you to communicate with your elected leaders, both in the House and in the Senate, and ask them, what's going on in Guatemala? what are the interests of the United States? How is our State Department carrying out the policies of President Trump? Not the policies of Ambassador Arriaga, not the policies of the Western Hemisphere Division at State Department, not the policies of left-wing agitators in Guatemala. What's in the interest of the United States? What's in the interest of the duly elected president of Guatemala, who has certain constitutional authority? All this is being pushed to the margins. And while it appears that, hey, we signed an agreement and everything is going forward, there's a lot of turmoil underneath. And your elected leaders need to have their attention called to this. You should pay attention to it because there's long-term consequences for the United States and for Guatemala itself. And so I want to take time out today to give you an update, a briefing. Believe me, this is the Reader's Digest. I'm giving you the short version of it. I could go on for probably an hour with all the who's who and what's what. I don't have the time for that, and frankly, it's probably a level of detail that isn't necessary. But you do need to be made aware of some very important facts that are unraveling or unwinding both in Guatemala and right across town here in Washington, D.C. over at the State Department, where there's some very nervous people. And they should be nervous because Judicial Watch is looking into this. We'll continue to look into it. We'll exercise all of our sources, both here in the U.S. and down in Guatemala. We'll conduct all the investigations that we normally do. Just as in last October, when my colleagues and I went down and marched along with the caravans in Guatemala, rather than talking about it, we went and saw it firsthand. But this is an important national security question. And there's a lot happening off the American radar screen that needs to be dragged back onto the radar screen. And some very tough questions need to be asked of the Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, of Ambassador Arriaga, of people within the Western Hemisphere Division of the State Department, because all is not as it seems. And we don't need a civil war in Guatemala, and we certainly do need a secure southern U.S. border and partners in an asylum program that would protect the interests of both countries. Thanks for tuning in and watching us. We'll be back next week with a 1-hour show. Hope you can join us then. I'm Chris Farrell, on Watch.